I have always loved working with my hands and creating things. I've learned to see value in something based off of how much time and skill was put into it. Lacemaking was founded on these principles. If you look at lace literally, it's just a tangled mass of strings in a beautiful pattern. The value is not in the materials, the value is in the time and the experience put into making it. For this reason, I was a little intimidated to start making it myself. It looks extremely complicated, especially bobbin lace, which is what I'm going to be making today. But I decided to be brave and try something new. In learning the craft itself, I also wanted to learn something about its history. What kind of people have made it, where did it come from, and why has it become so rare today? While researching these things, I began to realize that although lacemaking is a very specific path of history to study, it has a lot of things to teach us in the modern world. Lacemaking is very relevant in the study of women's work and what people have deemed appropriate for women to do. It's also very relevant in the discussion of cheap labor and the exploitation of the lower classes for that cheap labor. I have linked all of the sources that I used in my research below, and I will put a number on the screen each time I reference them so that it's easy to find them. Bobbin lacemaking requires a few tools that I had to acquire. So the first is a cookie pillow, which is the pillow that you put your pins in as you're working. For a long time, bobbin lace was called pillow lace because of these pillows. I did not want to purchase one as they can be rather expensive, so I made one out of a piece of round wood from Lowe's, some scrap fabrics, cork sheets, and cotton batting. Bobbins are not something that I was able to make, so I purchased those. The website that I used is called Manskyver Bobbin Lace, and I will link that below. As for threads and pins, I'm honestly not sure if I'm using the right materials. I'm worried that my thread is a little bit too thick, but I figured that's better than too thin if I'm a beginner because it will help me to see what I'm doing better. But in the future, I will probably be switching to a thinner weight of thread. This was the most complicated part of the research for me in actual production of lace. I didn't find very many clear sources that talked about which size threads are used for which types of lace. So if any of you know where I can find more information on that, I would love to hear from you. Pins, I'm just using some regular sewing pins with glass heads in a contrasting color to my pillow so that they'll show up better. I'm not sure if there's a specific type of pin I should be using, but I think these will work just fine. As for patterns, I'm using patterns from a website that very generously has a lot of patterns available for free, so I will link them below as well. Lacemaking has a long and complicated history. Its origins are shrouded in mystery, leading to a variety of fascinating legends. I believe that it has a lot to teach us about the history of women's work, as well as sweatshops and the exploitation of vulnerable people for cheap labor. Lace is a prime example of the value of handmade. For centuries, it was held in similar rankings with precious gems, gold, and expensive furs, even though it's literally composed of practically worthless thread. Lace holds its value in the time and expertise put into it, which leads me to more questions. What is the point of machine-made lace, and should it be viewed as a blessing or a curse? No one is really sure where lace actually comes from. There isn't any concrete evidence of it being made prior to the year 1500, although a few different countries hold legends of its origin well before then. The location is also widely disputed. Italy and Belgium are the two main competitors for the title of original lace makers, although France and Spain sometimes throw their hat in the ring too. There's a Catholic legend that the Virgin Mary herself was the original lace maker. As a model for all women, this might explain why the craft was associated with femininity for such a long time, with many women expected to learn the craft solely based on their gender. Lace is also frequently associated with purity and holiness, also ties to the Virgin. The Catholic Church was a huge patron of lace making. Part of this was to keep young, poor women out of prostitution, and part of it was a way for them to earn money. There's a long tradition of convents working to make and sell large quantities of lace. But where did the craft actually originate from, and how did the church ever come to be associated with it? In Venice, there's a legend that a sailor returned from a long voyage at sea with a beautiful piece of coral or seaweed that was given to him by a mermaid. This gift, sometimes called the mermaid's veil, was copied and thread by the Venetian women, and thus lace-making was born. In Le Puy-en-Velay, France, an embroiderer wanted to create a beautiful garment to place around the shoulders of her cathedral's famous Black Madonna. After attempting multiple forms of embroidery, she despaired that she could not create something beautiful enough and prayed for assistance. The Virgin herself then enlightened her to create intricate designs with thread on bobbins, the origin of lace. Several legends have come out of Bruges. In one, a woman named Serena was taught by the Virgin to make lace after praying to be able to support herself through a craft. When walking in her garden, spiderwebs floated through the air and landed on her black apron in an intricate pattern, which she copied with thread. This was the invention of lace. This legend ends with Serena teaching her many daughters to create and sell lace themselves. Another Belgian legend is that a dressmaker named Barb Winkle lost her fiancé at sea. She was sent a piece of seaweed as a memento and bitterly wept over it in her despair. When she saw that the seaweed was beginning to disintegrate, she copied it in an intricate pattern of threads, the birth of lace-making. She then attached these lace pieces to the dresses that she made, which became very popular among the upper class. As all of these legends attest, there is no clear answer to the origin of lace-making. In fact, all of these legends began to circulate well after the widespread production and use of lace, some of them as late as the 19th century. In fact, not only is the origin of lace complicated, but the history as a whole. The vocabulary is complicated, with one word being used at different points in time to mean different things. In addition to these linguistic challenges, lace styles and materials changed frequently. Fashion sometimes demanded that the lace be heavy and dense. Other times it was to be delicate and light. Sometimes it was made of silk and other times from flax. Certain types of lace were used on different types of gowns, suits, and household items. It's important to note how significant of a material lace actually was. It was often highly regulated, with laws preventing the purchase and wearing of foreign lace. It was also attached to a variety of sumptuary laws, which prevented the lower classes from wearing it. Among the elite, it was worn by infants, children, adults, and the elderly. It was worn in mourning, at weddings, on average days, and at formal occasions. It was worn in ruffs, cuffs, ruffles, petticoats, hairpieces, veils, bodices, cravats, and more. It was used on sheets, handkerchiefs, linens, and cushions. It was smuggled, stolen, and bought in enormous quantities. It employed hundreds of thousands of people, especially women, over centuries of time. It was made by children, men, and women of every economic class. It has been viewed as both shameful and pious, as the hobby of an accomplished woman, and as the sole source of income for desperate widows and mothers. There is an irony in the history of lace around the restrictions that have been placed on it. Almost every significant lace-making country has at some point or another decreed that citizens are not to purchase or wear lace from other countries. Not only did citizens break these laws on a regular basis, but royalty themselves would always be wearing the latest, most beautiful designs, rarely from their own country. Italian lace dominated the industry for a long time, especially early on. Beginning with intricate cutwork, they then moved to needlepoint and finally elaborate bobbin laces. Historically, they have created some of the most delicate pieces, and many types of lace even today are named in Italian. Dutch and Belgian lace makers had a leg up because they learned to raise flax, which was both strong and light, making it extremely suitable for lace making. In addition to this, their climate is often very damp, which is the suitable environment in which to create lace. Bobbin laces were usually made in convents, all-female schools, or by individual women working from home. Their lace was durable and more easily repairable than Italian lace, but often more expensive. France, like with many other elements of fashion, was always leading the world in new designs of lace. It was not uncommon for lower-class women in rural mountain communities to gather together and create lace. When this tradition later began to fail, patrons would come and employ hundreds of women in the same small towns to make more lace, keeping the industry alive. In 1704, 1/4 of the entire French population supported themselves in some way through the production of lace. England joined the lace industry much later. They popularized the idea that lace making was a feminine, productive hobby that all women should pursue. There are, however, more examples of men making bobbin lace in England than in other countries. Baby lace, a popular, cheap lace made in England and often sold to the Americas, was made by large groups of young children, especially girls. Working in poor conditions for 12 hours each day, sometimes with only a single candle for light, these girls developed eye problems and often became blind as they aged. Ireland was the very last to join the industry, although today they were still well known as producers of handmade lace. They introduced beautifully intricate crochet lace, in addition to creating new forms of needlepoint and bobbin laces. Although there are differences between these countries' lace histories, I think that they are more similar than dissimilar. Lace seems to be universally associated with women and femininity, with holiness and purity, and with wealth. Because it takes so long to create lace, even if the workers are paid extremely poorly, it takes money to own it. When, in the 19th century, machines began to create more and more realistic copies of expensive handmade laces, the industry fell apart and almost disappeared entirely. There are several reasons for this demise. The first is that machine-made lace is significantly cheaper to produce and to buy. Even if you are barely paying your workers anything, a machine doesn't need to be paid at all. Lace manufacturers did not need human employees to make and sell their products, which also meant that lace was cheaper to buy. Machines were also seen as a replacement of manual labor. This was happening all over the 19th century. Farms, transportation, and the fashion industry were exploding with new technologies that freed mankind from the physical labor that they were required to endure previously. No one was mourning the loss of rooms of little children having to work hours to make baby lace. Even if lace makers wanted to keep the handmade lace tradition alive, they couldn't afford to. Machine-made lace was equally beautiful and extremely cheap, which meant that they couldn't find any business. Their wages, which were already at rock bottom, dropped to nothing. Other jobs were also opening up for women at the time, such as in factories, which had better pay, although equally terrible or worse working conditions. So what if a woman wanted to work making machine-made lace? That's too bad, because machines were seen as a masculine occupation. Women's delicate, dainty fingers and sensitive dispositions were more suitable for the gentle movement of bobbins on pillows, not big metal contraptions. This led to men creating machine-made net grounds for lace, while women would produce handmade pieces to attach on top of this net. Although handmade lace dropped in popularity, the craft of handmade goods did not. There was a revival during the Victorian era, but lace making was seen as a feminine hobby and craft rather than an occupation. These pieces were not viewed with the same respect or awe that their predecessors were, although they were arguably just as beautiful. Tatting, crochet, netting, embroidery, sewing, and lace were accomplishments, but were no longer valuable additions to society. Although all of these crafts are beautiful, time-consuming, and require expertise, they have never been viewed as a true art form. This is not just during the Victorian era, but all throughout lace-making history. Lacemakers have never had their names attached to their work. Aside from legends, there are no great lacemakers, just a cloud of hardworking women that have since been forgotten. I can even see the argument that these women were themselves a machine for most of history. Is the replacement of their work with literal machinery truly terrible? It's a conundrum. On one hand, machinery defeats the whole purpose of lace. To quote John Ruskin, the whole value of lace as a possession depends on the fact of its having a beauty which has been the reward of industry and attention. That the thing itself is a price, a thing everybody cannot have. That it proves by the look of it the ability of the maker. That it proves by the rarity of it the dignity of its wearer. By making it widely accessible, free of error and the human touch, cheap and synthetic, it loses its entire value. When you remove the time and attention of the human hand, lace is just a tangled piece of string. Because of this, it is easy to argue against machine-made lace. On the other hand, it could be argued that the loss of the value of lace, even the end of the lace-making industry, brought an end to the widespread exploitation of women and children for cheap labor. Although, it's important to note that after the fall of this industry, women and children were just pushed into other bad positions, used and abused because employers could get away with paying them the bare minimum. This was the case for most of history, and it didn't magically change with the Industrial Revolution. To go back in time a little bit to 18th century England, women's options were extremely limited. If you did not have a husband or a man to support you, you would have to beg, rely on the church, become a prostitute, or become a lace maker. Lace makers had no job security. It was the worst paid job by far, but often the only option for widows with children to feed. The poorest women were unable to market their own products and were exploited by their employers. They often lacked an adequate supply of food and were forced to take children out begging. Although I haven't researched it extensively, I know that working conditions for seamstresses and other female factory workers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were horrific. Lacemaking seems like the precursor for this, as it was the worst paying job that a woman could have for a long time. To fast forward to the modern day, there has been a huge revival in textile crafts such as sewing, crochet, and knitting. I think that lace could easily fit into this. I believe that lace is one of the most beautiful things that human hands can create, and many of us today are fortunate enough to have the time and the opportunity to attempt to learn.